This is Vietnam, a Southeast Asian country home to just under 99 million people and one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Unfortunately, most people really only remember it for one reason: the Vietnam War. Almost everyone knows about the Vietnam War, at least the debates of whether America's interventions were justified, the errors that America made during the conflict, and whether America really had a chance to win the Vietnam War. However, while the discussions of such topics are essential, people overlook the much less known perspective of the Vietnamese during the war, their deeply rooted history of colonization and exploitation, the motivations of their leaders, and their persistence to be independent. Exploring this side of the narrative is crucial for a more comprehensive understanding of the Vietnam War and its profound impacts on all sides involved during the conflict. So, what's the history of Vietnam's colonization? What were the motivations of North Vietnam's leaders? And finally, how did North Vietnam manage to persevere through nearly 20 years of bloody, vicious, and relentless conflict? This video will seek to explain their side of the story, as well as to provide context for their spirit of resistance, which allowed Vietnam to stand their ground against the American giants, despite all efforts to force their submission. To understand the attitude of the Vietnamese during the war, one must first be aware of Vietnam's historical experience of occupation and exploitation by foreign powers. First, there was China, which dominated Vietnam for over 1,000 years between 111 BC and 938 AD, being ruled by a succession of Chinese dynasties. The first was by the Han dynasty, which attempted to assimilate Vietnam into Han sovereignty. The rule of the Chinese in Vietnam was seen as brutal and repressive, as the Chinese demanded high tributes and forced labor. There were many attempts during this period in which the Vietnamese attempted to regain its independence. However, all were quickly suppressed by the Chinese. In 938, Vietnam regained its independence after a millennia of Chinese rule due to the collapse of the Tang dynasty, which fell in 907. Now renamed Dai Viet, translated to Great Viet, the state enjoyed a golden era of independence between the 11th and the beginning of the 15th centuries. However, this too was short-lived, as Vietnam fell to the far more technologically advanced French forces in the 19th century. The French established the colony with a singular objective: economic exploitation. Vietnam was later integrated into French Indochina in 1887, solidifying the French presence in Southeast Asia. The French, like the Chinese, adopted assimilation, using puppet administrations to control the state, who often deprived the masses of economic and social benefits. Ho Chi Minh said in his speech in Ba Dinh Square, Hanoi, September 2, 1945, "The French were allowed to use any and all means to suppress any hint of native resistance, regularly extending to the point of criminalizing the mere act of identifying oneself as Vietnamese." Trapped in a thoroughly miserable existence, the Vietnamese were desperate for a savior. But after decades of failed rebellions, it appeared as if the colonialists had a stranglehold on Vietnam. However, unknown to the peasants at the time, a new revolution was already quietly taking shape. The groundwork did not originate in the fields or even a court, but rather unlikely, it emerged in a cafe in Paris, where a handful of Vietnamese who were lucky enough to afford Western education were engaged in discussions of a radical, new unknown ideology: communism, promising freedom and equality for the masses. The moment communism was introduced from abroad, it spread rapidly, becoming Vietnam's underground political movement by the early 1930s. The core of the communist movement in Vietnam was Nguyen Sinh Khung, or more commonly known as Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh left Vietnam in the early 1910s, eventually settling in Paris. There, Ho Chi Minh joined the Communist Party and discovered the writings of Vladimir Lenin. During the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, he also unsuccessfully petitioned for Vietnamese independence. Inspired by Lenin's success, Ho Chi Minh chaired the first meeting in 1930 of what will become the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, with the explicit goal of ending the colonial rule of Vietnam, his home country. But for all of his efforts, regime change in Vietnam would not be a result of the Vietnamese. Instead, from the most unlikely of sources, Imperial Japan. In 1940, Japan invaded Vietnam in their efforts for imperial domination in East Asia. In 1945, Japan officially took over Vietnam and threw out all Western influence. And during this period, Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh to fight off both the Japanese and French forces. Mere months after Japan had officially annexed Vietnam, they surrendered to the Allies. The Vietnamese seized the opportunity to take over the city of Hanoi and declare a Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2, 1945, ending the century-old status quo. Unfortunately for the Viets, the French were against Vietnam's independence, ignoring all negotiation attempts made by Vietnam, regaining control of Saigon in the process. So, Vietnam had no choice but to fight for their independence, and so the First Indochina War, or as known to the Vietnamese, the Anti-French War, began, which, after many deaths, ended in the Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954. An agreement was signed in Geneva on July 21, 1954, which temporarily split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, dividing the country into a communist north and an American-supported south. At this period, America's President Dwight D. Eisenhower said defeating Vietnam's communists was essential to block further communist expansion in Asia. America believed that if Vietnam became communist, then the countries of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. This was known as the domino effect and was so strong that America refused to sign the 1954 Geneva Accords ending the French War. Instead, America continued to fight, giving full backing to Ngo Dinh Diem, the leader of South Vietnam. However, as time went on, it became increasingly obvious that Diem was becoming uncooperative to his American allies and even more corrupt. In 1963, tensions reached a boiling point as Diem was unexpectedly assassinated in a military coup that was aided by the CIA. This, combined with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, paved the way for a full-scale US invasion. From the very beginning of the conflict, Vietnamese generals knew that achieving a conventional victory was impossible. America was simply too powerful to defeat using conventional military tactics. However, the huge rural population in the south was already mostly in support of the DRV-backed National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, providing crucial support. This allowed the Viet Minh alongside the Viet Cong to manage a string of successful campaigns against the disorganized South Vietnamese forces until large numbers of American troops began arriving in 1965. Following American involvement, Vietnamese defense strategies revolved around their extensive network of tunnels which resembled not just military fortifications but entire cities. Within these tunnels, one could find hospitals, armories, sleeping quarters, kitchens and wells that spread across over 320 kilometers. This extensive tunnel system hid and protected thousands of Viet Cong, which enabled them to fight the guerrilla war against the American giants. The importance of the tunnel system can be summed up by the words of Colonel Chow Lam. "We knew the Americans were determined to find and destroy the tunnel system. They understood, as did we, however Chu Chi went, so did the war. It was our determination not to lose even 1 centimeter of the tunnels. It was a contest of wills resulting in some very fierce fighting. We made a tremendous sacrifice to gain victory." Two years after America's arrival, the US expanded its bombing campaigns across North Vietnam in an effort to break their will to fight. When North Vietnamese civilians saw the first B-57 bombers open their bomb bays, One citizen did not decide to flee in panic. Instead, he was wondering, why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes? A minute later, somehow miraculously surviving, Vu Van Ving recalled that everything was shaking and that he raced home before shortly moving to a cave where limestone served as bomb shelters. He said, "I still couldn't register what it was in my mind." He was 15 years old at this time. "We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them," Vu proclaimed. Unfortunately for the Vietnamese, this was not nearly the worst event for them, as America only increased its presence and investment within Vietnam the longer the war went on. However, there was a major turning point in January of 1968 when the Tet Offensive began. Attacks were carried out across over 100 cities in South Vietnam. During the chaos, the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy, destroying the compound and bringing the reality of war to the urban population of the South, leading many to lose confidence in the Western-backed government. By the early 1970s, the endless warfare was starting to take a toll on both sides. However, the Viet Minh and Viet Cong remained determined to win, while American soldiers' morale plummeted to the point where soldiers were even ignoring orders and escaping. Desperate to maintain the status quo, America threw large amounts of resources into strengthening the South Vietnamese army while pulling its own traumatized troops out of the conflict. But it was too little, too late. And in April of 1975, a massive offensive by the North Viets known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign shattered through the defenses surrounding Saigon and seized the capital. After almost 20 years of conflict and millions of deaths, the Viet Minh finally stood victorious against all odds. Communism had won. Or had it? While the sacrifices made by the North Vietnamese during the war allowed them to survive and eventually reunite as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the conflict would leave millions on both sides dead. Additionally, America's constant use of herbicides and defoliants during the war, such as Agent Orange, not only deforested millions of acres, killing their ecosystems and causing the deaths of millions with various types of cancers and disabilities between 1962 and 1971, but still affects the Vietnamese wildlife and even human health today, causing congenital disorders and many more conditions. Furthermore, contradictory to international belief, communism did not spread through Southeast Asia after Saigon was seized, rendering decades of American obsession with the domino theory utterly pointless. America never fully understood that it was the desire for independence, not communism, that motivated the Vietnamese people to fight on against all odds.